Good Monday morning! Today we're having a developer discussion with Snugug. I'm going to describe Snugug as a developer with design tendencies. He's currently working at IBM, but will soon be working for Google. The interview that you're about to see is filmed at Nordic.js, a conference that I hosted, which is also why I'm wearing silver clothes, if you're wondering. But I actually met Sam in many years ago at JSConf EU in Berlin, where he presented a really cool project called Chef Watson that IBM had done. Like it was basically an AI that made recipes, like it figured out weird combinations of ingredients that work together. Sam is also the co-founder of SassConf. The talk that Snugug held at Nordic.js was about this thing called Houdini, which is a really cool technology that allows us to create custom CSS properties, which allows us to have these hardware-accelerated custom layout things, which is really cool. And it also allows us to do polyfills for new CSS properties that have not rolled out as standards yet. We also talk about practical productivity matters, like how to wall off your day so that you can work in undisturbed blocks, and we also talk about window management. Snugug also talks about how mistakes are born in organizations and how human error works, and it's not quite what you think. Before we get on with the interview, I would like to thank today's sponsor, LaunchDarkly. If you don't know LaunchDarkly, it's a software as a service product that helps you manage your feature flags. It's really nice. LaunchDarkly has been around for a while. I've talked about them on the show before. But what is new is that they have teamed up with Atlassian and created an integration with Jira. If you've worked with feature flags, you know that it's very easy to fall into this situation where you're releasing a feature and the information is in like 5 different places in like an email, and there's the issue tracker and there's your feature management system. Like it's just ugh. So integrating an issue tracker and a feature management product like LaunchDarkly, it's really nice because it gives you a lot more visibility and a lot more control. It's really nice to be able to see in your issue tracker if the thing has rolled out and to whom. It's just very nice. You can read up on how to combine Jira and LaunchDarkly by going to launchdarkly.funfootfunction.com. That link is also in the episode description. What is Houdini, and what is the problem that it solves?
Yeah, so the way that I like to think about Houdini now is in much the same way that service workers are a low-level JavaScript API for our cache. Houdini provides a set of low-level JavaScript APIs for render engines.
Yes.
Specifically, the ones that we're talking about now are furthest along are this idea of worklets, which are the actual render engine extension points. Yep. Custom properties, which allow you to define, give actual structure to the custom properties that you're currently using. The Paint API, which lets you have kind of like a canvas-like drawing context wherever you would use paint or an image in CSS. Animation API for doing changing animations based on scroll events, and the Layout API, which will let you actually build custom layouts, custom display properties.
So this essentially allows you to completely extend CSS to do whatever you want, like completely custom CSS properties.
Yeah, so the goal of the Houdini task force is to explain the magic of styling and layout on the web and provide the primitives to us to be able to do things like actually polyfill CSS, because today we can't do that. We can only write JavaScript that uses current CSS to kind of mimic stuff. But actually polyfilling Java or CSS is kind of one of the core driving principles of Houdini.
Seems to me like this could be amazing for designer-developer collaboration. At Spotify, we had a lot of people who were very apt at CSS, but there wasn't really, like, the whole tech stack was so complicated that I couldn't really extend it. But it would be pretty cool to be able to create like custom things. Like, for instance, if you implemented custom animations in your project, like transitions between your components and stuff like that, and allow designers to prototype and fiddle around with that while just in Chrome DevTools in their applications.
Yeah, so the two biggest things that I think are going to be real boons to designer and developer collaboration are the Paint API and the Layout API. One of the demos that I gave is a tab component. So the standard tab component where you've got like a tabbed accordion and you've got that nice little inner swoop at the end of those tabs that are really hard to do.
Yep.
You can make a paint worklet for that, which I did, and read in the background color of that tab. And then wherever you want to use that, you just say border image or outside, I think, paint that image, and then set the background color you want. And it paints it. And then you can resize them based on properties that you have in CSS. You can recolor them based on background, and it'll just go with everything that you have.
So for people listening, like, might be thinking like, hey, can't you already extend CSS sort of with JavaScript today by just, writing JavaScript and just making animations with JavaScript? And like, what is the difference there?
So the key difference here is the Houdini specs are designed to work at render engine speed. So you could create an SVG and have JavaScript parse the properties and then change all that SVG for you. But that's a lot of work, all happening on the main thread to get a very small visual effect. Whereas with Houdini, you have this painting context that automatically scales, automatically resizes, and can pull in those properties for you, and doing so at the render engine speed. I think a great example of where this becomes really powerful is the Layout API. So one of the examples I show is masonry layout with the Layout API. A masonry layout, if you want to use it today, is a ton of JavaScript, and it's terrible for performance because everything gets absolutely positioned.
What is that?
So the masonry API is the masonry layout is when you have elements of different heights, usually, that stack, go across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but they bump up against each other so that the actual height is staggered. It was really popular a couple years ago, especially on like infinite scroll feeds. But to actually get that effect,
but the Pinterest thing, basically.
Exactly. But to get that to work, it's a lot of JavaScript and a lot of CSS that's bad for painting and bad for layout. For the actual like painting and layout as of the browser render engine. With Houdini, it is less than 50 lines of JavaScript with no dependencies. You can change how many columns and what the gap between everything is using standard CSS properties or custom CSS properties, and it works at render engine speed.
That is gorgeous.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got into development in the first place, like at the very start?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of something I fell into. So I worked as part of a US congressional campaign for a couple of months. And my job on that congressional campaign effectively was the tech czar for 3 months, which means I was the technical person. So I helped build their website, and I helped kind of do all the tech IT stuff around the office. And then as I was looking for a summer job one year, I found this job with the New York State Senate. And the New York State Senate kind of combined two passions I had at the time, technology and politics. And they actually wound up initially hiring me in as a project manager, not as a developer. But after a couple months, I got promoted into a developer role. And that developer role, they gave me a little bit of training with. And then I had a mentor, and I just kind of went from there. And as I was doing that, I was a back-end Drupal developer there. And I found that I really liked front-end work, so I kind of fell into responsive web design about a year after Ethan Marcotte's article.
Ethan Marcotte's?
The original responsive web design article. Okay. So I found that, and I got really interested in that, and I started doing that about a year after that article came out. So I've kind of been on this edge of responsive web design since.
You've done a lot of things. It feels like you're front-end and machine learning. And what else?
So most of my background started doing Drupal development. Moving on to front end and responsive web design. I've done some UX work as part of responsive web design. Right now, I mostly do front end development, node development, and DevOps. Because I find that that type of tooling stuff, first of all, interests me, but second is really critical to producing high quality work. So I've gotten to a point in my career where I kind of do a lot of things every day, but it's not because that's like I started doing all those things. I focused initially on front-end development, and then once I had like a really, really strong grasp of that, I added in these other things as I've needed them.
Yeah, I find that DevOps especially is extremely valuable as a front-end developer. Even if like at my last workplace, I didn't spend a lot of time like doing actual back-end work, like setting up servers and keeping them in production. However, being able to set up build systems for your tools, like getting Docker images running and getting them running in the build system cloud, that kind of stuff, not being dependent on backend developers to do that, but to create those build systems yourself made you such a better front-end developer. So I really like the idea of like diving into multiple things and not getting like too married to your specialty.
Yeah, I like to think of it as being a T-shaped individual, where you have a deep expertise in one thing, and then shallow knowledge across other areas. And you can start to become like H-shaped and W-shaped and whatever. I'm probably closer to H now because I've got like a deep front-end development and a pretty deep node expertise, and I'm growing a DevOps expertise. But having that focus, then having a broad set of other skills is important as well.
Start with what does a typical workday look like for you?
Yeah. So at our work, we work in a process that's kind of a modified agile process. So first thing in the morning, we get in and we have stand-up, where myself and the members of my team talk about what we did the previous day, what we're planning on working on today, and if we have anything that's going to block us from making forward progress.
Do you have an actual, like, is your stand-up an actual stand-up? Like, do you stand up?
No, we do not stand up because we are lazy. That and we're all in person, so we all kind of just spin around in our chairs and look at each other and chat. Stand-up also, oftentimes, we get it done pretty quick, usually only about 5 minutes. But then we spend probably the next 10 or 15 minutes catching up just personally and other stuff that we want to talk about.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we've got a pretty friendly team.
Yeah, stand-ups are kind of like some people can do responsibly sit down in stand-ups, and some people just can't do it. It just like if they sit down, it just sprawls to like 25 minutes and even more. Like in those places, I've like pushed for like, no, we're gonna do an actual stand-up because you people are like really like talking. That is why we stand up. All right, do continue.
Yeah, so we do that, and then I try and schedule most of my meetings in the morning, because I find that I'm most productive when I've got a big chunk of time to work. And because stand-up's in the morning and I already have some kind of disruption in my work in the morning, I like putting all my meetings in the morning. So sometimes we'll have meetings in the morning. And then I mostly work in the afternoon after lunch.
How do you, working in big chunks is like a lot of developers like that, and it makes a lot of sense to do it. But it's also in practice, it might be tricky to do in many workplaces because there are many like external forces that try to prevent you from this. Like, what are things that you do, that you have started doing in order to like get more firm, long blocks to work with? Do you have any tips for people that have a hard time doing that? So
my best tip is to schedule meetings with yourself for the large blocks of time you want to work, and then block off your calendar.
Oh, that's brilliant. So you just look like busy.
Yes.
Oh, that's clever.
And no one can schedule meetings. I can't. I've got a conflict. I've got a meeting on my calendar. You should. So that's what I like to do. I did that a lot in my previous role, where I really needed to make the space. My manager now is a lot better about having structured space for us to work. So yeah, that's what I like to do. There are some days where we have kind of like big meeting days.
Yeah.
So our schedule, our sprint schedule is a 2-week schedule from Wednesday to Tuesday. And every Thursday in the afternoon, we have backlog grooming where we work with our kind of wider team to maintain our backlog, maintain our project's health. And so those are big afternoon meetings, and we kind of can't get rid of those. And every other Tuesday, we have like our end of sprint stuff. So we do a demo to our wider team. We have a retrospective within our own current team about how that last sprint went. And then we plan for our next sprint.
Yeah. Is there any other habit that you have picked up, or technique or something that you have picked up during the last few years that you feel like have really made a difference to you as a developer that you would be able to share? Do you have anything like that?
Yeah, so there are two. One is I got really comfortable in the terminal. I don't like Vim or VI. I still actually am a Sublime text user.
Oh, old school.
So I use Sublime Text 3 because the way that I use the terminal is I effectively use Sublime Text 3 as a GUI version of VI. Everything's its own window. Everything is kind of separate. And because it's a native app, it opens so much faster than everything else.
Yep.
And then I just live in the terminal otherwise. So that's one thing that's gotten me oodles of productivity, getting really good at the terminal.
What do you mean, like Vim, everything in its own window? Can you elaborate a little bit?
So Atom and Visual Studio and even Sublime Text by default is set up like an IDE where you've got all of your files on one side, and then what you're working on, and then tabs for everything. So instead of doing that, every file gets opened in its new window. I don't have any tabs. I don't have the minimap. I don't have the file browser on the side. It's just the window I'm working on, the text I'm working on,
I see.
and then my terminal.
All right. So you switch between the windows, or do you keep them in small little spaces?
So that's the other thing, is window management. I got really good at window management. I have a program on my computer that lets me set spaces or places on my monitor where I want to put windows and attach global keyboard shortcuts to all of them. So whenever I open up text, I've got keyboard shortcuts to throw it to the left, the right, the 4 quadrants. If I'm on my big computer or big monitor and I have my full keyboard, I've got thirds set up. So that window management has been key to my productivity as well.
Nice. For me, Moom has been a boon. I really, really like it. Like especially when you switch between monitor setups, between your laptop and plugging in a screen and having it like snap into the structure that you want. It does make a lot of difference. Is there any book that you've read in the last year or years or so that you feel like have impacted you as a developer, or possibly an article or something, like some piece of writing or material that you would recommend, like people really should read?
Yeah. So a lot of the things that I've been reading recently are around cultural transformation and organizational transformation, because a lot of the work that I've been doing outside of my day job is to help build a better front-end development community at IBM. So there's one book that I read some of, I didn't read all of it because it's really big, called Diffusion of Innovations, which describes how things get adopted based on a whole bunch of research.
Oh, I love that. I want to read that.
So it's a really giant book, and probably start with a Wikipedia article, and then if you're interested, go into the book. But it's a whole bunch of research, and then all the discussion around that research about how things get adopted. Early adopters, innovators, early majority, late majority, laggards, and kind of the bell curve of adoption, and where you need to get to actually have adoption start to stick.
I have this bucket list thing that I want to design a language, and everybody wants to design a language, but I want to design a language with like popularity in mind. Like as an experiment, can we design a language that is like basically the language equivalent of a populist party? So like something that is there just to like gain a lot of traction.
Isn't that JavaScript?
I suppose. Yeah, but I think it should have like some kind of very heavy object orientation and like static typing. It should kind of feel like Java to the Java developer. Yeah, like it's kind of like very much catering to the audience kind of thing, you know. And that is why I really like the idea of why ideas spread.
Yeah, so that's a great one. The other two would be The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is a book about how scientific revolutions happened, how changes in thinking about science happened, and specifically what is the term? Paradigm shift. If you've heard the term paradigm shift,
Yeah.
your understanding of that term was coined in this book. Ooh. Yeah. So it describes how how science is normally taught, that it's one continuous stream of building on top of each other, isn't true. And what actually wound up happening was these series of paradigm shifts and what led up to them and what caused things to stick and things not to stick. And that kind of worked really well with Diffusion of Innovations. And then the last one, which I think is probably good for everyone to read, is The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error.
Oh, tell me about this.
Yeah, so The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error is a book written about understanding human error. But specifically, it's about different ways of thinking about how human error comes about. The big takeaway is the old way of thinking about human error, according to this book, is that someone did something wrong, and they're the reason something failed. Whereas the way that they're describing it is there is a system in place, and a human was trying to work within the system's constraints, and the system wound up breaking under those constraints and how they worked. So it's not necessarily it might be the person's fault, but they make a distinction between like legal culpability, where someone was trying to do something wrong, and the system failing under the constraints that were in place.
Could we do a segue back to what we were talking about during the warm-up?
Yeah,
with
sure.
Vasa?
Sure.
Yeah, because we're here in Stockholm, and there is a museum for like It's better that you tell it.
Yeah, sure. So the museum is for this. I think it was a 16th century warship, a Swedish warship that was like the biggest, best thing that was ever supposed to roam the ocean. And if it had ever actually gotten out, it would have been like the most heavily armored warship of the time. Yeah. And 20 minutes out of port, while it was still in Stockholm, literally 100 meters or so from where the museum is, it sank. A small gust of wind came, and it keeled the ship over, just like that, and then it sank to the bottom of the ocean. And then they were able to raise it in the 60s, I believe. Yeah. And the story that I was told while I was there from the tour guide is the way that shipbuilding worked back then, everything was kind of in the master shipbuilder's head. And there was a contract with the king, and the king wanted it to be a really, really big ship, but he also wanted it to be a very narrow ship so it went fast. And the problem that we had is because everything was in shipbuilders' heads, if they didn't have something to work off of, they just kind of made it up. So they were following the king's instructions, but what wound up being produced was a ship that was really long and really, really tall and really, really narrow. And those three things combined made for a ship that was entirely unstable.
Brilliant.
And
basically the equivalent of having many features, no bugs, and fast and cheap.
Exactly. And at the end of the story, no one wound up getting blamed for this colossal disaster because the shipbuilder was following the contract they had, the shipmaster was following the contract they had, and the contract was following what the king said he wanted, which was a tall, long, narrow ship.
That's so brilliant. And again, like coming back to that, it's just people working within the constraints that they had. Mm-hmm. And what probably should have been done there is that somebody should have seen, like, we cannot do this within the constraints that we have.
Yeah, something should have happened, but like the constraints wound up breaking the project, and that was like the systemic failure, was the constraints that the system had in place.
So a lot of people watching the show are like people that are not so long into their careers, and when they're watching speakers and people that have been around the block like you, like it seems talks tend to be about successes. You only see people's successes mostly. And it's very rare that people go about on stage talking about their failures, and which means that like the imposter syndrome just roams free. So, a question I would like to ask you is, can you tell me a story about a failure, like something that, a mistake that you did that impacted you negatively, and that was only your fault, it wasn't imposed on you in any way? Would you be comfortable with sharing that?
Yeah, sure. So 2 years ago, I was working on a project to rebuild Watson's documentation, maybe a little bit more than 2 years ago. And I had joined IBM a little bit earlier, about a year and a half earlier than that, specifically because I didn't want to work with Drupal. Specifically didn't want to work with Drupal, but I knew that in order for a new documentation site to be successful, we needed a content management system. Now, myself and the other senior developer who was on the team, we all kind of looked for alternatives, but we basically decided that the things that we wanted were best suited if we just built our own content management system. We open sourced it. There was a lot of good work in there, but we had a hard time convincing our documentation team to use a content management system. They were kind of convinced that all their content was individual and was hard to structure. So I made the decision at the time that it was more important for us to stand up a good content management system, even if it took more time, rather than standing up a quick content management system and getting people actually using it quickly, because my view was that if we stood something up quickly and they liked it, then that's what we would be stuck with. So I didn't want to do that. And what wound up happening was we had been given 6 months to get this up and running. And we got it mostly up and running in 6 months, but the fact that no one could play with it, no one could work with it for that 6 months meant that it kept getting harder and harder to get buy-in once it was actually available. So the project wound up getting scuttled before we were able to launch it or finish the CMS, because there was just a lot of tension built up, because it was just us promising that something would be delivered, even though we had agreement on the delivery date. Because they couldn't do anything in that time, it was just time for us to argue about.
Everyone had
opinions.
Had a lot of time
Yeah.
to decide that they didn't want this.
Yeah. So because we didn't have something tangible for them to work with quickly, it kind of became moot that we had a good thing at the end, because the project didn't exist anymore because we took too long to deliver a thing.
Is there anything else that you would like to add? Something that you would like to tell my audience? Like something that something you want to communicate to like 880,000 junior developer, or not everybody is junior, but.
So one thing that's a little bit unique about my story is I didn't go to school for computer science. Not only did I not go to school for computer science, I don't have a degree. Everything that I know, I kind of learned on the job, and was that initial New York State Senate kind of taking a chance on me and mentoring me. So it's entirely possible to have a successful development career without having that formal computer science training, or even without having a formal degree, even at large companies like IBM, where I work now.
That is an excellent point. I want to push that as well, actually, because I don't have my background is in theater and video production. So I actually feel like that should be pushed a lot more. Like people with various interesting backgrounds. I've interviewed a bunch of journalists lately, because journalism is a shrinking area, and it becomes natural for journalists to move over to programming, because it's a lot about creating structured pieces of text and thinking a lot about stakeholders and how things fit together. So it's like they bring something very interesting in, plus that they are superb at writing documentation. And also, I heard this talk, I think it was at JSConf where we met, a guy who talked about moving from forklift driver to JavaScript developer.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
I really like that talk. I think that's really important, because we have a lot of like, oh, you have to study computer science in order to become a fantastic engineer.
You might need to know some of the computer science stuff for specifically coding interviews,
Sure.
but you don't need that in your everyday work. I have never needed to reverse a linked list or write my own depth first binary search tree. Never ever.
No, I made use of a binary tree once, like the binary tree search. I did that for like be able to search an array very fast, but it's kind of like and it really...
or npm install
binary search tree. I know. All right. So where do people find you online to follow you and keep up with the stuff that you're doing? What's the best way of doing that?
So the best way is Twitter. Snugug on Twitter. SNUG.
Put it here. There.
So the best way to follow me online is Twitter. SNUGUG Snugug. That's also my website. I don't update that so much. And if you're interested in the Houdini stuff, there's a website, houdini.glitch.me, which is an interactive introduction to Houdini that you should go play with.
Sweet. Thank you so much for coming. This has been like, it was a blast talking to you.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you for having me.
Bam.
That was awesome, that final look in the camera.
That is it. You should follow Snugug on Twitter. There's a handy link to his profile in the episode description. And in the episode description, there is also our sponsor. LaunchDarkly now has a very handy integration with Jira, and you can check out how that works at launchdarkly.funfunfunction.com. In case you are new, you have just watched an episode of Fun Function. I release these every Monday morning, 0800 GMT. But you will forget that, so you can subscribe by clicking here, or watch another episode right now by clicking here. I am MPJ. Until next Monday morning, stay curious.